Sometimes, when death seems inevitable and hope fades into darkness, the impossible breaks through reality. Today, you're about to witness a story that defies every logical explanation, where faith collided with catastrophe 30,000 feet above the earth, and what happened next changed not just one life, but hundreds forever. Before we continue, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I really want to see how far the power of these stories is reaching. Captain Daniel Morrison had flown for 23 years without incident. His record was spotless, his reputation impeccable, and his confidence in the cockpit was a kind built from thousands of hours navigating storms, turbulence, and technical failures. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for what would happen on Flight 447 from Miami to Chicago on that cold November evening. The day started like any other. Daniel kissed his wife Sarah goodbye at 5 in the morning, their 3 children still asleep in their beds. Sarah had grabbed his hand at the door, holding it a moment longer than usual. Something in her eyes seemed hesitant, worry perhaps, but she simply smiled and said she loved him. He promised to call when he landed, just like always. That promise would become the most important one he'd ever made. The Boeing 737 was loaded with 217 passengers. Families heading home for Thanksgiving, business travelers rushing to close deals before the holiday, college students eager to see their parents. In C-12A sat Margaret Chin, a grandmother of 5 traveling to meet her newest grandchild. In 23C, there was Marcus Williams, a construction worker who had saved for 2 years to take his daughter to Disney World. Row after row of ordinary people living ordinary lives, trusting their safety to a man they'd never meet, a pilot behind a locked cockpit door who held their futures in his experienced hands. The first hour of the flight passed smoothly. Daniel's co-pilot, a younger man named Jeff Patterson, chatted casually about his upcoming wedding. The sky was clear, the instruments reading normal, the plane cutting through the darkness at cruising altitude. Daniel had flown this route so many times he could practically do it in his sleep. But then, without warning, without even a split second of indication, everything changed. The explosion wasn't loud. It was something worse. It was a deep, sickening crunch of metal tearing apart, followed by a violent shudder that ripped through the entire aircraft. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Screams erupted from the passenger cabin. Every alarm in the cockpit began blaring simultaneously, a cacophony of warnings that meant only one thing: catastrophic failure. Daniel's hands moved on pure instinct, scanning instruments, adjusting controls, trying to understand what had just happened. The readings made no sense. Both engines showed critical failure. Hydraulic systems were gone. The altimeter was spinning downward at a sickening rate. They were falling from the sky, 30,000 feet of empty air between them and the frozen ground below. Jeff's face had gone white. His hands trembled as he worked through emergency procedures, his voice cracking as he radioed Mayday to air traffic control. But Daniel knew, with the cold certainty that comes from decades of experience, that no emergency procedure covered this. Whatever had happened to their plane, whatever mechanical demon had seized control, they were beyond the reach of training manuals and protocols. The aircraft began to spin, not the controlled descent of an emergency landing, but a chaotic, violent plunge that threw unsecured objects against the cabin walls. Daniel could hear the passengers screaming, could imagine the terror in that cabin. Parents clutching children, strangers holding hands, everyone facing the same horrifying reality. They were going to die. All of them. In less than 3 minutes, this metal tube would slam into the earth at terminal velocity, and there wouldn't be survivors. Daniel fought the controls with everything he had. His muscles strained, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold air rushing through a crack somewhere in the fuselage. He tried every technique he knew, attempting to regain even a fraction of control, but the plane wouldn't respond. It was like wrestling with a falling boulder, utterly futile, yet he couldn't stop trying. 217 lives depended on him, and he was failing them. The altimeter spun past 15,000 feet, then 10,000. The ground was rushing up to meet them, though they couldn't see it through the darkness. Daniel's mind flashed to Sarah, to his children sleeping peacefully in their beds, completely unaware that their father was about to die. He thought of never seeing them again, never holding his wife, never watching his kids grow up. The grief and regret were so overwhelming they nearly paralyzed him. That's when something inside Daniel broke. Not his courage, but his pride. His entire career had been built on skill, on training, on the belief that a good pilot could handle anything. But this was beyond him. This was beyond any human capability. For the first time in his adult life, Captain Daniel Morrison admitted to himself that he was completely, utterly powerless. 5,000 feet, maybe 90 seconds left. Daniel's mother had been a devout Catholic, praying the rosary every night before bed, attending Mass every Sunday without fail. She had tried to pass that faith to her son, but Daniel had drifted away as an adult, letting religion become something from his childhood, pleasant but irrelevant to his modern, rational life. He hadn't prayed, truly prayed, in more than 20 years. But now, hurtling towards certain death, every logical option exhausted, Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment and spoke words he barely remembered. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," he whispered, his voice lost in the chaos of alarms and screaming metal. "Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." The hour of death was now, perhaps 30 seconds away. "Please," Daniel begged, tears streaming down his face. "Not for me. I don't matter. But these people, these innocent people, the children, please, please. There has to be something. There has to be a way. I don't know what to do. Please show me. Please help me, please." His voice broke into sobs. Jeff was screaming something beside him, but Daniel couldn't hear it anymore. The entire world had narrowed to that desperate prayer, that final plea to a power he wasn't even sure existed, a last grasp of hope when hope had abandoned them. 3,000 feet. And then Daniel opened his eyes and saw her. She was standing in the cockpit between him and Jeff, as real and solid as anything he'd ever seen. A woman dressed in blue and white, her face serene and beautiful, her eyes filled with compassion so profound it stopped his heart. She shouldn't have been there. It was impossible. The cockpit door was locked, and besides, people don't disappear out of thin air. But there she was, and Daniel knew, with absolute certainty, who she was. The Virgin Mary looked at him, and somehow, despite the screaming alarms and the plane's violent shaking, her voice was perfectly clear. She didn't speak out loud. The words simply appeared in Daniel's mind, calm and certain. "Pull up now. Full throttle. Trust me." It made no sense. The engines were dead. The controls were useless. But Daniel didn't hesitate. His hands, which had been frozen in despair moments before, suddenly moved with absolute confidence. He pulled back on the yoke with all his strength, pushed the throttle forward to maximum, and waited for nothing to happen. But something did happen. The engines roared to life. Impossible, because the instruments clearly showed they'd been destroyed, but Daniel heard them, felt the power surge through the aircraft. The plane's nose began to rise. Slowly, impossibly, the death spiral began to correct itself. The altimeter stopped its terrifying descent at 1,200 feet, barely a quarter mile above the ground. Jeff was staring at the instruments in absolute shock, his mouth moving but no words coming out. The plane was responding. Everything that had been dead was suddenly alive again. Daniel fought the controls, using every bit of skill he possessed, and now, miraculously, the aircraft was obeying. The spin stopped. The descent slowed. They were still falling, but now it was controlled, manageable. Daniel glanced to his right, where the woman in blue had been standing. She was gone, vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared. But her presence lingered, a warmth in the cockpit that hadn't been there before, and Daniel felt a strength flowing through him that wasn't his own. "Chicago approach. This is Flight 447, Daniel said into the radio, his voice steady despite everything. "We have regained partial control. Requesting emergency landing at nearest airport. We're not going to make O'Hare." The air traffic controller, who had been listening to their Mayday calls and expecting only silence or impact, sounded stunned. "Flight 447. Say again? You have control." "Affirmative. It's not pretty, but we're flying. Get me somewhere to land now." They directed him to a smaller regional airport 15 miles away. Daniel nursed the damaged aircraft through the sky, still not understanding how it was possible, not questioning it, just focusing on the task. The engines kept running despite, showing complete failure on every gauge. The hydraulics responded despite having no fluid pressure. The plane was flying on something beyond mechanics, beyond engineering. The landing was the hardest thing Daniel had ever done. He came in fast, too fast, but he had no choice. The runway lights appeared through the darkness, and Daniel aimed for them like a man throwing a dart at a board from across a room. The plane hit hard, bouncing once, twice, the tires screaming, the brakes barely functional. They skidded down the runway, veering dangerously to the left, and Daniel was certain they would cartwheel into a fireball, but they didn't. Against every odd, against all logic, the aircraft slowed, straightened, and came to a shuddering stop just 50 feet from the end of the runway, where the pavement gave way to an open field. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. Then, from the passenger cabin, a sound began to build. It wasn't screaming this time. It was crying, laughing, cheering, the sound of 217 people realizing they were alive when they should have been dead. Daniel sat motionless, his hands still gripping the yoke, his entire body shaking. Jeff was laughing and crying simultaneously, repeating, "We made it, we made it. Oh God, we made it." Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, their lights flashing in the darkness. The evacuation was chaotic, but successful. Every single passenger and crew member walked off that aircraft. Some had minor injuries from the turbulence, but nothing serious. Nothing that wouldn't heal. As Daniel stood on the tarmac, watching families embrace and strangers comfort each other, Margaret Chin approached him. The grandmother, who had been on her way to meet her newest grandchild, took his hands in hers. "I saw her," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "When we were falling, when I closed my eyes to pray, I saw the Virgin Mary in my mind, and she told me not to be afraid. Did you see her too?" Daniel couldn't speak. He just nodded. "Me too," said a voice behind them. Marcus Williams, the construction worker, stood there with his young daughter holding his hand. "I've never been religious, but I saw her, clear as day, and she told me to trust a pilot, that he would save us." One by one, other passengers approached. Not all of them, but dozens. Different ages, different backgrounds, different face, all saying the same thing. They had seen her. They had felt her presence. In their terror, in their final prayers, something had reached back. The investigation that followed became one of the most baffling in aviation history. The plane's black box recording showed total engine failure, complete hydraulic loss, and a descent that should have ended in impact. The damage to the aircraft was catastrophic. 3 separate teams of engineers examined it and concluded, independently, that the plane should not have been flyable. One investigator was quoted saying, "According to everything we know about physics and aviation, everyone on that plane should have died. I cannot explain what happened. But Daniel could explain it, even if no one would believe him. He had seen her. He had heard her voice. He had followed her guidance, and she had saved them all." His life changed after that night, not in dramatic ways, but in the small, important ones. He started attending Mass again, first awkwardly, then eagerly. He held his wife tighter, spent more time with his children, stopped taking single moment for granted. He kept a small statue of the Virgin Mary in his flight bag, and before every flight, he said a quiet prayer of gratitude. 6 months later, Daniel received a letter from Margaret Chun. She had indeed met her newest grandchild, a beautiful baby girl. They had named her Maria, in honor of the Virgin Mary who had saved her grandmother's life. Enclosed with the letter was a photograph of Margaret holding the infant, both of them smiling, alive because of a miracle 30,000 feet in the air. Daniel kept that photograph on his desk at home, next to his family pictures. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever his rational mind tried to dismiss what happened as coincidence or hallucination or mass hysteria, he looked at that photo and remembered the truth. He had been powerless. He had prayed. She had answered. 217 lives had been saved when all hope was lost. Some called it a miracle. Some called it impossible. Some searched desperately for logical explanations that didn't exist. But Daniel knew what he had witnessed. In his darkest moment, when death seemed certain and all his skill meant nothing, Faith had broken to the impossible. He had asked for help, and help had come from beyond the veil of this world, wearing blue and white, speaking with a voice of infinite compassion. Captain Daniel Morrison flew for another 12 years before retiring. Not once did he enter a cockpit without remembering that night, without feeling grateful for the second chance, without acknowledging that some things exist beyond human understanding. He had been a man of science and logic, but he had become a man of faith, not because of what he'd been taught, but because of what he'd experienced. The story of Flight 447 spread quietly, mostly among those who believe that miracles still happen in our modern world, that prayers are heard, that the line between heaven and earth is thinner than we imagine. And for those 217 passengers and their families, and everyone they would touch in the years they had been granted, the truth was simple and unchangeable. They should have died. They didn't. And the reason why defied everything except faith. Thanks for watching this incredible story. You won't believe what happens in the next one playing on your screen right now. Click to watch it.